Also, if you would please bring Mr. Brigandi.
Thank you, Professor. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so honored to be asked to be here today. I'm the chief of the Philadelphia Law Department Civil Rights Unit, and when I was asked to speak, I asked, well, what's the topic? And I was told it's making police pay, and that scared me a lot because my job is to avoid having police pay. But as we'll discuss, this litigation, the frequent litigation that we have in 1983 cases in the city does result in positive good in change to the police department, and we'll discuss that towards the end. I just want to give you a quick overview of what my department handles in terms of litigation per year. We're a 10-attorney unit. The law department total has about 150 attorneys. Again, my unit has 10 attorneys per year, and this is police cases only. I also represent the prisons, but I'm just talking about police cases. We get between 250 and 300 new cases a year. The great majority of those cases are allegations of excessive force, and excessive force can range from you handcuff me too tight to a taser case, a case where a baton is used, of course, all the way up to the shooting cases, which of course are the ones that are the focus today in the media, and for good reason. Of those 200 to 300 cases, on average, we settle, the monetary amount is $7 to $8 million a year. So if you average that out, each case is worth approximately $25,000. Of course, that is misleading because you have certain cases that will settle for multi-millions of dollars, and then many others that will settle for very low value. The Philadelphia Police Department has 6,600 police officers. I believe, as of right now, it's the 5th largest police department in the country. On an annual average basis, those 6,600 police officers make 250,000 documented civilian interactions. Of those 250,000 interactions, 40,000 result in arrests, and again, 250 to 300 result in lawsuits. So that puts it into perspective, but with that being said, 300 new cases worth $8 million a year is a significant dent in the city's budget, and especially my unit's budget. So the question, do police officers pay? Generally speaking, monetarily, the answer is no, because the city represents them and indemnifies them. You probably assume that the police officers don't have to pay because it's in the contract with the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police. And that's misleading, at least for Philadelphia. The reason police officers don't have to pay out of their own pockets in Philadelphia is because they're protected by what's called the Municipal Tort Claims Act. We refer to it as the Tort Claims Act. And basically what that means is that officers are protected from liability in civil cases, in these types of cases, as long as they don't either commit a crime or engage in conduct, which is, it's termed willful misconduct. Those are the magic terms that we use in deciding whether to indemnify an officer or not. What is willful misconduct? It's defined in the statute as conduct which a reasonable officer would know is wrong, and that the harm that results, he knew that the harm would result from his actions. So basically, it's if you're a reasonable officer or a person and you know that what you're doing is wrong, like smacking a guy who's in handcuffs over the head with your baton 10 times, I think a reasonable officer would know that's wrong. That's willful misconduct, even if it doesn't result in criminal charges. So in those instances, we try to filter those cases out, and in cases where officers are not indemnified by the city, they're on their own. Now, what's the problem with that? Police officers are basically judgment proof. they make on average $60,000 to $75,000 a year. So if you get a $5 million verdict against a police officer, you're not going to collect anything. So, where is the deterrent for police to avoid these lawsuits? Well, I think it's two things. Is first of all, I know from experience that no police officer wants a judgment filed against them, whether it be $10,000 or $5 million. I mean, these are people who have families and want to buy houses and cars, and if you have these judgments out against you, you're not going to be able to do that. But secondly, and again, from personal experience, most police officers take these lawsuits personally. Even though they know that they're not going to be financially on the hook. They worry that if they get the judgment against them, it'll look bad in the department. It might cost them rank as far as promotions. They're afraid that it might go in their personnel file. So they do take this kind of litigation personally. Well, who does pay? I mean, if someone is wronged, if a plaintiff is wronged, they bring a lawsuit, how do they get the money? Well, the answer is that the city pays. And again, as long as there's no finding of willful misconduct, the city will pay. However, and I'm going to give examples. It's very hard in 1983 litigation to sustain a claim against the city entity. First of all, the city is not subject to punitive damages, so you don't have to worry about that. And then secondly, you basically, I could spend a whole day talking about municipal liability, but you basically have to show that the city had either an unconstitutional policy or bad training. And it's a very high bar to sustain. But again, there are instances where there are cases where we have cut officers loose in my office, and the plaintiff's attorneys have been able to sustain their municipal liability claim against the city, and we end up in federal court in front of a jury defending the city. It's rare, but it happens. And in most of these cases, the facts are just incredibly tragic, because normally when we're cutting an officer loose, he's committed a crime. We usually do that up front. I have never had a circumstance in my years at the Civil Rights Unit where we have litigated the entire case up through trial, up through verdict, while representing the officer, and then turn to him when the verdict's read and saying, "Sorry, buddy, you better go put that home in your aunt's name, because we're not going to indemnify you." That's never happened. It usually happens well before the discovery portion of the case closes. Determining whether or not a case involves willful misconduct, it might seem easy at first glance, but it isn't easy. I'm going to give you 3 examples of cases that I tried personally, and I used my cases because they're the ones I remember the best. And the first case is a clear example of criminal activity where the city settled due to the horrible record of the police officer. The second instance is just an overwhelmingly tragic case where the city was kept in the suit because, again, of the horrible record of the police officer, and the family of the plaintiff won a huge judgment, but it wasn't against the city. And the third case is a case where we represented an officer, and again, a tragic case, but it's a very fine line as to what constitutes willful misconduct. And in that case, the city indemnified the officer. The first case was a case from 2011, Howard Williams versus former Officer Rudolph Gary. Officer Gary had been on the force approximately 5 years, And during those 5 years, he had 4 instances, 2 while in the academy and 2 while he was an active police officer, where he would get into a domestic argument with his wife and make threats. At one point, he pulled a gun on his wife's family, and in each instance, the police would show up, the situation would be calmed down, and he was never disciplined for any of this. And these were 4 separate instances where the police showed up at his residence. In fact, in one of the instances, the sergeant that showed up said that Officer Gary could not have been more disrespectful. He wouldn't obey commands, and basically he was just out of control. But again, never disciplined. So there comes a day in May of 2011 where he's he's picking up his child from the wife he's separated from, and there's a block party at his wife's house. And when he goes to pick up his son, the children on the street are playing with water cannons. They're having a water gun battle. And when he pulls up in his SUV, his window's down for the passenger seat, and his girlfriend's in the passenger seat. And one of the young children goes and squirts his girlfriend with water. And she gets very upset, and Rudolph Gary gets out of his car. He's off duty. This is his personal vehicle. And he confronts his wife about why this child squirted his girlfriend. And then he gets in a fight with his brother-in-law. His name was Howard Williams. Howard Williams was the brother to the wife. And they end up getting in a shouting match. And during the shouting match, Rudolph Gary went back to his vehicle and retrieved his police-issued Glock, came around, and Howard Williams got in his face. Rudolph Gary took his gun up and shot him 3 times in the face. And then when he was laying down on the ground, stood over top of him and shot him again in front of everybody. Okay. He was arrested. He immediately got in his vehicle, fled the scene, and went to the local police district and said he had to discharge his firearm because he was being assaulted on the street. Everyone knew that that was not the case. Within 2 hours, he was charged with murder. Long story short, he was convicted. A lawsuit followed. Obviously, the city is not going to indemnify Officer Gary under those circumstances. However, based on the fact that Officer Gary had that terrible record in the academy and in his 5 years on the force, the court said that there's enough evidence that the city failed to discipline him and train him that they would hold the case against the city. So obviously, given the horrible facts in that case, I settled it. Okay, I settled it for a substantial sum of money. Well, it's not confidential. I settled it for $650,000, which, considering everything, isn't horrible for the city. Again, the reason that case settles, because it is so hard to sustain a Monell claim even in front of a jury. And the second example I'm going to give you shows how hard it is to sustain a Monell claim against the city. This is a 2007 incident. It's William Panis versus Officer Frank Tepper. It was tried in the Eastern District in 2012. William Panis was a 20-year-old man. Officer Tepper was a 20-year veteran of the police force who had just the worst record I have ever seen. He had 20 years of basically acting like a thug, threatening people while he was on duty, threatening people while he was off duty. He was disciplined during the course of that 20 years. Leading up to this event in 2007, he had had 5 years of relatively good behavior. He hadn't gotten into any incidents where he was disciplined. So on an April night in 2007, he was hosting a baby shower for his daughter. And he was drinking, and he was intoxicated. And during the baby shower, William Panis showed up to the house with some of his friends because they wanted to get into a fight with one of the cousins that was at the baby shower. They were all unarmed, but they stood outside the house and told the guy to come out of the house. Eventually, Officer Tepper came out. He was off duty, but he had his gun, and he says, "Get the hell out of here." And William Panis said, "You pussy, you're not going to use that. I know who you are." Right then and there, Officer Tepper shot him. 2 shots in the chest. He was dead. We tried that case because we could not settle it. And the jury came back and said, the first question was William Panis, was Frank Tepper acting as a police officer? They said yes. Secondly, was the city deliberately indifferent to the need to discipline Frank Tepper? Yes. Third answer, did the city cause Frank Tepper to shoot William Panis? No. That means we were totally off the hook. They awarded the family $4.7 million against Frank Tepper. Family hasn't seen a dime because, again, the city will not indemnify Officer Tepper. So that is the best example I could think of a situation where the city will not indemnify and the plaintiffs end up with nothing. And I take no happiness from that. That's a tragic case. The last case, this is a case where you really have to think of, is there willful misconduct? 16-year-old boy, William Pelzer. This is a 2005 case. And William Pelzer was playing dice with some friends at an abandoned drug house. And the officers came up to him and said, "Show me your ID." He goes up to the officer, shows him his ID. As they're running his ID over the radio, it comes out. He's wanted. He hears that. He runs. The officer went over radio, gave a description, and the description did not include the fact that she didn't frisk him. She had no idea if he was armed or not. It just gave a description, and it said, he's wanted. It didn't say for what, he's wanted. 2 minutes later, backup officers see the suspect, Mr. Pelzer, who matches the description. They attempt to stop him. He flees. He flees into a backyard, and he tries, as the officer comes around in the backyard, he's trying to climb a cyclone fence, and the officer says, "Get down off the fence, this chase is over." His hands are in his pocket, okay? The officer says, "Take your hands out of your pocket, take your hands out of your pocket." He won't. Finally, he takes his hands out of his pocket, and the officer sees a silver shiny object in his hand. He fires one time, he kills him. Okay? The facts that the officer didn't know was that the guy was wanted as a scofflaw, meaning a summary. He failed to show for court for some sort of summary citation, and the object was a cell phone. Okay? We tried that case, and we lost it. And we lost it for $124,000. You're thinking to yourself, how does that happen? This was back in 2007. The reason it happened is because the law on excessive force is very favorable in the Eastern District, well, in the Third Circuit, for police officers. And secondly, it was 2007. If that case were tried today, I would think there would be a much bigger verdict. And towards the end, if I have a chance to address questions, I do want to touch just a bit on the effect that this litigation has on police training and police policy, and it will be, in my view, a positive effect. Thank you.
Professor Robinson?
Thank you, Professor Revan L. As she's told you, I teach in the tax area, and so I'm not going to talk about cases like that. But I am going to talk about ways in which I think that the power to tax and the power to fine have been conflated to the disadvantage of three different entities. the taxing entity, the city or town, the contributor, the person who's been fined, and the police. You know, law enforcement has become an important source of revenue for many localities. For example, in the fiscal year 2015, New York City collected approximately $957 million in fines, and that constituted about 16% of its operational budget. These collections were violations of a variety of city rules: parking and moving, red light, bus lanes, speed cameras, quality of life kind of stuff, noise, littering, consumer affairs, public health. And those amounts were collected by the police force. How can that happen? Because we pay taxes for police protection, right? That's the price we pay for civilized society. We expect the police to protect and to serve. Instead, this describes the police force as a revenue collector instead of a protector. Now, a little bit about how we pay for government ordinarily. That's through property taxes. I'm sure whether you are an owner or a renter, you have paid property taxes. Renters pay that as a part of the cost of the lease. And for local governments, the property tax works well. It's pretty stable because it's based on the value of property, and you can't really pick your house up and move it to the next jurisdiction until tax day is over. You're stuck. So it's easy to administer, but that's also a disadvantage. The stable base is a disadvantage. If property values are low to begin with, then the locality is going to have trouble meeting its budget. They may also drop. Revenues may drop if property values stagnate as costs go up, or if they decline and fail to keep pace with what had been established need. Second, in lots of places, voters have decided that they don't want property taxes raised, so they erect bars to raising those taxes. Even if the property tax works well, there are going to be supplements. And some of these, again, you are aware of. You pay most of them. Retail sales taxes ordinarily are turned to by cities, a lot of them. And then we pay special transactional tax, such as on meals, hotels, automobile rentals, etc. You pay fees to get a driver's license, to get a hunting license, to do other things, an occupational license in a city. You may pay a charge in order to use a park, a golf course, etc. And all of that goes into the pot, but there still may not be enough. When that happens, some towns turn to fines to fill the gap. In fact, a lot of them have. So you've heard about Ferguson. People have talked about Ferguson earlier today. I, too, am going to talk about Ferguson. And I'm going to use Ferguson as a very bad example of what can happen when local governments turn to fines as a way to close a revenue gap, and they use the police force as a part of the effort to do that. Ferguson, of course, Ferguson is now symbolic of worst outcomes when you have a confrontation between a police officer and a young black man. Michael Brown, of course, died on a Ferguson street of bullet wounds which had been inflicted by a white policeman, as it turned out. The U.S. Justice Department conducted a huge investigation, and in trying to establish what happened, discovered that law enforcement was deliberately revenue-driven, and that those practices contributed to a pattern of unconstitutional policing and discrimination against the city's predominantly black and poor population. What happened in Ferguson was that beginning around 2000, the complexion of the city literally changed from predominantly white to predominantly black. It had been about 3/4 white at the beginning of the year 2000, and by 2010, it was 2/3 black. In the meantime, the governance force and the police force remained predominantly white. Initially, the city was financially stable, but then came the Great Recession of 2008. Unemployment soared, property values plummeted, property tax revenues as a result declined. And as that happened, of course, the budget suffered. They couldn't raise property taxes easily. That would have required a voter referendum. So the path of least resistance, since there was no other way to do this, was to turn to fines. The police force was instructed, and I actually looked at 10 years of budgetary records for Ferguson, and it's all there. It's really pretty amazing. We need to bring the police force up to full strength so we can improve the bottom line. They've got to get more collections through fines. And that is what happened. They became very aggressive in enforcing traffic and lifestyle regulations. So I'll give you some examples, and most of these are drawn from the Justice Department report itself. A traffic stop, and they at one point had installed red light cameras, and a police officer would sit in an intersection away from, of course, where drivers could see, and as the cars approached, it would be yellow, and then he'd change it to red just as the car was going through the intersection. Yeah, they kept those up for a few years until it was challenged in court, and then they took them down. But they had 3 separate lights installed in town to do that. But they could stop the car, of course, issue a citation for running the red light, get the same driver for driving without a seatbelt. If there were a child in the car, then you could issue another citation for having a child who wasn't properly restrained. Expired driver's license, too bad. No registration, what a shame. No insurance papers, well, tough for you. That was one example. Hanging out could also be a problem. We know youngsters like to hang out. You could be cited for loitering, public indecency because the pants were riding too low, resisting arrest, attempting to explain what you're doing there, inciting civil disobedience, defending a friend. And let's not forget something like a prohibition against walking on the roadway if there's a sidewalk. Michael Brown was walking in the roadway when he was accosted by the policeman. The record reports what happens next. The 67% black population accounted for 85% of traffic stops, was more than 2 times as likely to be cited, and almost 2.5 times more likely to be arrested. The more citations an officer wrote, the more effective his policing was considered to be. Blacks were also more likely to receive multiple citations when stopped, so that my example was not an exaggeration. In more than 73 stops, they received 4 or more citations. This happened only twice with others who were stopped during the same period. Blacks accounted for 95% of walking charges, 94% of all failure to comply charges, 92% of resisting arrest charges. And that's only a partial listing from the report. Alleged offenders, many of whom were unable to pay and make the citation go away, encountered difficulties. You know, a lot of us, I include myself, I got one speeding ticket a long time ago, and I paid, and it went away. That was the end of it. But if you aren't able to pay, it will, of course, not go away. You have to go to court in order to resolve it. Sometimes the reasons for failure to appear were personal. No babysitter, work obligations, I forgot. Or if you went, then there were additional difficulties encountered. Crowded dockets, lack of representation, limited economic resources. So all of this caused additional fines, court costs, interest, penalties. A ticket, which may have initially been for $50 or $100 or $200, all of a sudden had a much higher price tag as penalties and fees and interest piled on. This other Ferguson was predominantly black and poor and disproportionately burdened by this behavior. These were not fellow citizens, these were not neighbors who were issued discretionary citations. They were rather an important source of revenue. These were disingenuous practices in that this is revenue collection, which masquerades as an exercise of police power. And as the report points out, they were frequently of questionable legality. These citations abused discretion, they were racially discriminatory, and they threw far too many citizens who were already financially hard-pressed into economic peril. Those practices have now been largely halted because of what the Justice Department did and because of changes in Missouri law. But the reliance itself has not been outlawed. It's just the percentage of reliance that has been reduced. Further, Ferguson's fiscal weaknesses remain. Property values are still low, and so collections remain flat. Sales tax collections are increasing, but slowly. So even though they've dodged the bullet for the moment, this has not all gone away. Now let me talk a little bit about the problems with fines in general. from this little narrative, I will point out numerous examples of how things go wrong when there is reliance upon fines as budget supplements. And the effect is global: government, alleged offenders, the civic spirit, as well as the police force. And I'll give you a few examples. Let me say initially that I really don't have any fundamental problem with fines. I think it's completely appropriate to fine in the right circumstances. For example, I shouldn't be able to get up in the morning and say, I'm going to drive everywhere today at 100 miles an hour. That just can't happen. So we need rules to instill certain modes of behavior, and if those rules are violated, then the person should be held accountable. But a fine is not a tax, and that's what Ferguson was doing, treating a fine like a tax. It is an involuntary contribution to government, and so a fine and a tax share that characteristic. But the similarities end at that point. If you're talking about a tax, a well-designed tax is going to exhibit 4 characteristics. 1, it's going to be equitable. That is, it will treat people fairly. 2, it's going to be certain. The person who has to pay the levy is going to know where to pay and when to pay. 3, it's going to be made as convenient as possible. There's going to be a clear path to discharge the levy, and once that has been accomplished, then that ends it. 4th, it's going to be efficient. There'll be a limit on how much can be collected overall. With the possible exception of certainty, a fine doesn't have any of those characteristics. So if a fine is not a tax, the person fined has been involuntarily burdened in both cases. We're talking about an involuntary burden, but involuntarily burdened without any of the protections that a taxpayer has. It is an exaction which is intended to punish. It's also not a fee. It's not a user charge. I'm not purchasing a service of any kind, and I'm not taking advantage of a privilege. I'm not going to have a fishing license. I'm not going to be able to go to a bike path as a result of paying a fine. As such, it is one thing to impose a fine and then to have the fine paid legitimately for some reasonable infraction. It, however, is quite something different to assess a fine simply because police departments have ticketing or arrest quotas. It is an appropriate exercise of police power when it's properly deployed, but it should not be among the array of resources for support of local government. Again, a fine is not a tax. Fines, improperly deployed, undermine transparency and confidence in government. It obfuscates, it corrodes taxpayer confidence. Taxpayers are going to lose confidence because in this kind of system, this kind of cost is opaque, it is unfair, it is unpredictable, it is onerous. For all of these reasons, it's not a good thing. It targets behaviors inappropriately, not because there has been a violation of societal norms, but because people are simply out of sync, perhaps, with what is deemed to be acceptable behavior. Kids playing outside who are too large, who are too loud shouldn't be fined. Young men who wear lowriders, that's not aesthetically pleasing in my view, but it shouldn't be fined. These fines are abuses of discretion, and they are legally indefensible, as far as I'm concerned. What about the alleged offenders? Might this be excessive taxation? I would submit that it is, because they're being forced to pay again when they've already paid through property taxes and sales taxes and fees and charges. Fines add to that burden of support for government. Does this constitute excessive taxation? I would suggest that it does. Almost certainly it did so in Ferguson. Indeed, I'd strike almost and say it certainly did so in Ferguson. Fines can impose economic hardship. Another professor has, in speaking about the explosion of criminal justice debt, refers to a bewildering array, and here I quote, a bewildering array of fees, fines, court costs, non-payment penalties, high interest rates that have turned the criminal process into a booming revenue center for state courts and corrections. She was talking there about the justice system, criminal justice system. The same thing is true when it happens for local governments. And fines are the first element in that financial monstrosity. Let me give you a bit of imagery. Think about an upside-down pyramid, an inverted pyramid. Well, fines at the bottom of that pyramid. If you can address the problems of fines, then I think you can begin to correct some of those financial abuses. Unresolved citations, I submit, can be ticking time bombs. Last June, the U.S. Supreme Court decided Utah versus Streif. The court held that a suspect, subject to a valid, unrelated, outstanding arrest warrant for an unpaid parking ticket, could be searched pursuant to that unrelated warrant, and incriminating evidence seized incident to that search could be used against them. Justice Sotomayor, in her eloquent dissent, spoke to the holding's unsettling consequence. This case allows the police to stop you on the street, demand your identification, and check it for outstanding traffic warrants, or any outstanding warrant for that matter, even if you're doing nothing wrong. If the officer discovers a warrant for a fine you forgot to pay, courts will now excuse his illegal stop and will admit it into evidence, anything he happens to find by searching you after arresting you on the warrant. The Justice Department, in the Ferguson report, noted that of 21,000 people living in Ferguson, 16,000 of 21,000, 3/4 of the population, have outstanding arrest warrants. The chilling possibilities, I think, speak for themselves. In terms of civic costs, the Justice Department report speaks eloquently to this point. When police in courts, and this we've heard over and over again today, but when police in courts treat people unfairly, unlawfully, or disrespectfully, law enforcement loses legitimacy in the eyes of those who have experienced or even observed the unjust conduct. This loss of legitimacy makes individuals more likely to resist enforcement efforts and less likely to prevent and investigate crime. If policing is to be more effective, officers must act in accordance with the Constitution and additionally treat people fairly and respectfully. What about effects on the police themselves? When revenue generation becomes the focus and policing practices are geared to that objective, public safety becomes a secondary concern, if that, and community trust and cooperation are undermined. Police evaluations and promotion are driven by the number of citations issued. As a result, community residents become potential offenders and sources of revenue. This is what happened in Ferguson. The Justice Department report asserts that Ferguson has resolved and intends to correct these practices, and there's a lesson for all of us here. So to end, there are many cities and towns like Ferguson, not all to the same extent. Ferguson is an outlier, but I looked at some of the other cities and places in which there have been incidents, and fines are always a part of the budget. The fiscal plight, therefore, differs only in degree. But even in the face of financial stressors, officials must continue to strive for fairness and for transparency in the fullest meaning of that word. The lessons from Ferguson inform the effort. The police force should not function as general tax collectors. At its best, policing should be a quintessential public good, owing allegiance to the state, or more accurately, the taxpayers that the force has pledged to protect and serve. Police persons are simply unable to live up to this oath when those who would be protected, who should be protected, become instead targets of financial opportunity. One last point, unpaid monetary penalties, which are inevitably a part of this, will undermine collection efforts. It remains the case that you can't get blood out of a turnip. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'm going to monopolize my power as the moderator for just one moment, and I actually have a comment and a sort of an invitation to you all, but I have to say, in listening to some of the enforcement of the laws in Ferguson, I was reminded of the black codes of the early 20th century. And for those of you who aren't familiar with them, it's worth looking up and spending a little bit of time thinking about. And then I actually have a question for Mr. Brigandi. And one of the things that you had mentioned throughout was this idea of the horrible record of the police officers involved in some of the cases, the 3 examples that you gave us. And I imagine that if the audience here is anything like me, one of the things that that they were wondering, at least I was why were they still police officers at this point? And why are we at the point of municipal liability? I mean, one of the things that we've been talking throughout today is sort of reform and training and, you know, root cause analysis. And some of these examples, I don't even know that we need to go so far as root cause analysis to figure out a solution here. So in your perspective as trying to handle this from this ex post perspective, how do you think we could have perhaps prevented some of these really tragic incidents?
Well, I would posit to say that if you asked former Commissioner Charles Ramsey and current Commissioner Richard Ross what their biggest obstacle is right now, it would be the FOP. The FOP in Philadelphia is very powerful, and the contract that they have is, it's almost impossible to have a police officer fired unless they've been convicted of a crime. That is just the way it is, and it's something that that's what causes these incidents. I mean, the examples I gave you, thankfully, are the exception rather than the rule. I mean, Frank Tepper's record, I've never seen one even close to it, and the record of of Rudolph Gary in the academy, I don't know how he passed the academy. He shouldn't have, but he did. One thing that I did want to say is that with all the litigation, and Philadelphia is very litigious, but one of the positive outcomes of all these 1983 cases is that, you know, and the media attention. The media attention right now on police, and particularly the shootings, has had a positive outcome in both the training and the policy of the police. As an example, in 2007, and these stats I'm giving you include all police shootings, not just deaths. These are all police shootings of civilians. In 2007, we had approximately 63. It went down to 40 in 2011. And then in 2012, we went back up over 60 again. And Commissioner Ramsey said at that point, and partially because of media pressure, I'm going to invite the DOJ, the Department of Justice, to come in and audit the Philadelphia Police Department. And he did it voluntarily. And they did come in and conducted a 2-year audit of all police shootings over the course of, I believe, a 15-year period. And as a result, they put out a report last year where they made 91 recommendations regarding training, investigation, and policy. And I believe the police department is implementing, of those 91, they're implementing 85% of those recommendations. And the only reason they're not recommending all of them is either FOP issues or budgetary restraints. But the rest of them they're implementing. And in 2015, there were 22 civilian discharges. And as of 2016, I tried to get an exact number today, I could not, but it is below 15. And you know, we're in November now, or reaching November. So we're seeing a significant reduction in police shootings, and I think it's a result of the media pressure that we see today, the DOJ coming in and auditing us and telling us we need to do better, and of 1983 litigation. I think it has an effect on the commissioner.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is for Mr. Robinson. So I agree with your premise and the idea that police shouldn't be basically tax collectors. My question has to do with the advocacy that's out there now pushing for fines in lieu of incarceration. There are many scholars and activists saying this is what we should be turning to, maybe the day fine system as they do in European countries. Mm-hmm. So could I ask how you feel about that type of a measure within your framework?
As I said, I have no problem with fines per se. I think fines appropriately levied are important to maintain the social fabric, if you will. What I have difficulty with is using the police as a center for profit for local government. So if you earmark the collections and you put them to use someplace else other than in supporting the budget, perhaps for reinvestment in the community or something of that kind, then I think that takes the profit motive out of it. It maintains fines as a part of the legal justice system, if you will, but at the same time, it takes that money and reinvests it in the community in a constructive fashion.
Yes.
Also, thank you for your presentation. I was fascinated by Mr. Brigandi, your recitation of your experience handling civil rights cases in Philadelphia. In Chicago, we have, on average, 500 a year, and we are spending between 20 and 30 million a year in settlements and judgments, not counting the blockbuster false imprisonment cases. I'm curious as to when you get those cases and you see Officer Lightfoot as a frequent flyer, or even if it's not a frequent flyer, but somebody who's done something particularly egregious, what's the line of communication between your office and the police department to make sure that some kind of action, even if it's just retraining, is taken so that whatever the underlying circumstances are don't occur? That's I think, a difficult issue and one that we're sort of grappling with.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very touchy issue because I'm a lawyer handling civil cases, and I do meet with the commissioner on a semi-regular basis, but I can't start acting as the disciplinary arm of the police department. It's just not my place. But what I can do is I can tell him, I can say, you know, Commissioner, we are seeing the same officer over and over and over again. This is his 4th shooting in 6 years. This is his 6th instance where he's used his taser on a person, you know, ended up, you know, being sustained for violations. And I can couch it in a way that I can say, Commissioner, we are no longer going to indemnify this officer if he keeps this pace up. That's how that's the leverage I have, is indemnification. Because those officers, as soon as they're cut loose, they're on their own. And again, they don't want that judgment against them. That's about, you know, and certainly I'm the attorney for the commissioner on a policy level. I'm like, Commissioner, you don't want this officer putting the city at risk because his record is just piling up and up and up. And they're usually receptive to that. But again, with the strength of the FOP contract, it is mind-boggling some of the allegations, sustained allegations, that the Internal Affairs has levied against officers who are fired, charged, and if they're not convicted, they get it's automatic, they get their jobs back. It's mind-blowing. So my hands are tied a little bit on that.
I just want to follow up with one of the questions about why something isn't being done for these officers that have these offenses. And I'm very well aware of the power that the FOP has, but at the time that the officers are in the academy, do they yet have the protection of the FOP? So if they're exhibiting these behaviors, like Officer Garrett, how is he even allowed to become a police officer? Because then you run into a problem like someone else in the audience said, you're getting an officer like that that's riding with a rookie that's influencing and poisoning their mind with all of these methods.
Yeah.
So how do they even get from the academy to being a patrol officer?
Yeah, they don't have the protections of the FOP in the academy. They're on probationary status. He fell through the cracks, and again, he's the exception, but it's terrible. Yeah, he would not have FOP protection in the academy. He was counseled in the academy. I received his academy record, and there was a counseling memo in there saying you need to stop being such a hothead, or you're not going to be a very good officer. And he got his badge. As soon as he gets active patrol, he has those protections. Within 2 years, he had at least 3 more instances where he was investigated, and 2 of which he was sustained to be in violation. It was wrong.
Can legislation be used to overcome these FOP controls over the police? In other words, can we pass laws that say that that overcome this? We're going to keep back cop because he's one of us, union.
I would hope so, but I'm not a labor attorney or a contract negotiator. I don't know the answer to that.
Have you seen anything in any state being done?
No, what I've seen is an attempt to get leverage over the FOP in the next collective bargaining session to maybe make some concessions, but that's really I think the only efforts they have right now.
What does work?
What does work as far as disciplining the officers?
No, as far as having leverage over the union to dislocate.
Oh, for instance, you know, body cameras are coming out. You know, the FOP, you know, body cameras are going to be mandated in 5 to 10 years. But the FOP wants some concessions. So it's like, well, if you want those concessions, then you have to do other things. I mean, that's basically how it goes. It's a very laborious process that, frankly, I'm not very familiar with, and I don't want to be familiar with it, in all honesty.
I have you know, a lot of us are sitting here today getting our CLE credits, right? And we have to have, I forget the number, we have to have every year, including an ethics credit, in order to maintain our license to practice law. So police officers have to, every year, get recertified by going to their mandatory training under WAC, Act 180, and the state holds their certification. Why can't the state just pull their certification and pull them out from under the union and say, guess what? You can't be a cop anymore because you're not certified. The disciplinary board does that to us all the time.
Right. Yeah. It's a great point. I've never seen that happen. I don't know if that's prevented by some sort of FOP contractual law. I don't know, but it's a great point because I mean, officers are retrained every time they shoot their weapon, whether it be a dog or accidental or at a civilian. They do receive retraining and recertification on an annual basis, and again after they discharge. You know, whether there's a sustained violation in a shooting, whether the state can hold that over their head and have their license taken, I don't know the answer to that, but it certainly is a chip that could be used.
Has the FOP ever been a defendant in 1983 litigation? I mean, they're state actors if they're really public functions, if they are in part responsible for keeping the bad apples on. Anyone tried suing them and holding them liable?
In my time there, I've not seen that happen. I don't know if they would be qualified as state actors for purposes of 1983.
I'm a con law professor. I'm telling you public function exemption.
Okay.
There you go, right?
Very good, yes.
You don't have to be a governmental actor to be held liable.
Right.
It's a public function.
Yeah, but I've not seen that.
Maybe plaintiff's lawyers here should think about it.
Yes.
Yeah, back there.
So there's been a decent amount of news about nationwide about police officers moving to different jurisdictions after they have incidents. And does the Philadelphia Police Department have a background check system so that Philadelphia is not the victim of this kind of?
Oh, yeah. That's not an issue of people coming in who have been disciplined elsewhere. It's a very thorough screening process as far as criminal background goes in order to get into the academy. I will say that. Now, what occurs at the academy, and you know, what do you have to do in order to get booted out of the academy? That's a question that I probably should get a better handle on because the example I gave, and that should never happen.
I'd actually wanted to address something to Professor Robinson before I go there, since I wasn't in office to represent the FOP. Most Philadelphia police officers are very competent, good, and you've only hit on a small number of cases where it's gone outside there. You see the zero tolerance. There's a lot of pushback in schools because zero tolerance works in a lot of injustice. So if you're not in something that's totally egregious, if you're into something that's a judgment call, it's always going to be over-inclusive or under-inclusive. But what I want to ask Professor Robinson about was, do you think privatization of the collection effort for these fines has contributed to the problem? And I've seen like a lot of articles recently about bail, where people are forced to take guilty pleas in order not to sit in jail for 6 months and get out and not lose a job. So if you could address that.
I think privatization has done us a disservice in many areas, and this is only one of them. to the extent that any protections exist in the public sector to try to hold people harmless and protect against overreaching, they're lost entirely once it moves into the private sector, because it really then becomes 100% against profit, about the profit motive. So yeah, absolutely, I agree with you. I think privatization makes the problem worse rather than making it better. It simply makes it unnecessary for the public to pay for continuing collection efforts instead of continuing to sue it in perhaps a more gentle fashion.
We'll just take one more question, and it's gonna be time for our break.
Thank you. Professor Robinson, the figures that you quoted, were those just court fines, or do they include property forfeitures as well?
They do not include property forfeitures. That's another aspect of it.
Well, thank you to our panelists.